Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fifth official episode of the Black Rose Gaming Dungeons and Dragons discussion. I'm the host and GM, Mikado. You can call me Mick. Let's go ahead and do a quick roll call before we get started. Animus, are you there?
I'm here for the moment.
Balasar, are you there?
Yeah.
Treva, are you there?
Ohio.
All right. And a quick heads up for anybody out there watching. Animus is having some trouble with his recording equipment, so he may or may not end up not being able to finish out the episode with us. And what you just saw there is I have a character sheet up because today we're talking about combat. So, when you have a character that you've made up, you have, of course, your ability scores, your strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, and all of that. You have your HP, which is going to become very important when we talk about it later. One of the first things you need to remember with combat is initiative. Initiative is the first thing that happens when you go to set up a combat. Everyone rolls for initiative, and that decides who goes first, who goes last. And the way you do it is by, at least with Pathfinder and a few other similar systems, there's usually an initiative score, for lack of a better word, modifier, it says on the sheet here. You have your dexterity modifier, and then you add in any kind of miscellaneous modifier, like if your class gives you some kind of special addition to your initiative, you add that in. Then, to make an initiative roll, you roll a d20, add your initiative number, and that is your initiative. And that is your place in line for combat. There's a few different ways of deciding things. There's the idea of allowing players to switch back and forth with what spot they're in. Some people like to do it before combat, some people allow them to do it during combat. Personally, I prefer, once combat has started, to make everyone stay in the position that they're in. However, I'm not completely adverse to the idea of letting people switch down. What I mean by that is, let's say you have 3 players, and one of them rolls a 20, one of them rolls a 15, one of them rolls a 10. The person that has the 10 is going to be last, the 15 is second, and the one that rolled a 20 naturally goes first. If the person that rolled a 20 thinks that they're not going to be so much useful as the person who rolled the 10, then they could swap down with that person, which admittedly lets that person switch up, but no one gets to decide that they're going to switch upward. You can only ever switch down yourself. And there's also people that you can decide to go last, and then it just goes to whoever was next underneath you. Initiative is always important, though, and I don't like letting people reroll their initiative. I think you guys all know that, but what are your particular thoughts on that? What about you, Animus? Do you think it's okay to let people reroll their initiative?
I mean, that it depends on the situation and how forgiving the GM is being. There are also initiative styles where you re-roll initiative all the way around every round.
That is true. Another important thing that I should have probably gotten to first is the difference between a turn and a round. A turn is your individual chance to take actions during combat. A round is the entire list of players and the enemies that are in combat together. Once you've gotten to the end of the list of people in your group, everybody's taken their turn and acted. The round that you're currently in has ended. So, if it's the 4 of us together, the list that it has in Discord here would be Animus goes first, then Balasar, then me, then Treva. After Treva has gone round 1, the first round of combat has ended, and it starts round 2 with Animus getting to go again. And as you said, there are systems that allow that. There is a way of doing it that you re-roll initiative every turn as kind of a. I've seen it mostly defined as a dramatic system for combat. I don't know if what you've seen it listed as before. What about you, though, Balasar? What do you think about letting people re-roll their initiative?
I usually go with the judgment of the DM.
All right. What about you, Trevor?
In my opinion, you shouldn't be able to re-roll it, but I'm not averse to letting someone hold an action for one round and then letting themselves like go back to their original spot.
Personally, I think that holding an action is different than changing your initiative because holding an action is literally you're not taking an action right now, so that when the parameters, for lack of a better word, of that action are met during the next round, the action takes place, and then during your actual turn, you still get to take your next turn because you saved an action by not taking one previously. And there are systems of combat that give you bonuses to doing that kind of thing. It depends on the system, depends on the player class. But I think what I was trying to get across to you guys that may not have been very clear is that if a person rolls a 1 on their initiative or rolls a very low number, I really don't want them to re-roll it because someone's going to go last. No matter what, someone always goes last. Also, with rolling dice, instead of just deciding straight up who's going to go at what point, with rolling dice, there's always the chance of people rolling the same number. And when there's a tie, you have to figure out how to break the tie. The way I prefer to do it, and there are other schools of thought, but the way I prefer to do it is the two of you rolled a tie, so instead, if it's Pathfinder like you guys see on my screen here, then you just go ahead and roll a d20. Both of you. Roll one, and then whoever gets the higher number is the person that goes in front of the other one. What about you, Animus? How would you deal with a tie?
I like the flat roll off for determining who goes first.
Alright, what about you, Belisar?
Eh,
Um,
it all depends.
Depends on what exactly.
Well, I've seen where they've actually had two people roll the same initiative and then basically attacked one after the other.
Well, I mean, that would technically be the same as them just deciding which one of them takes their turn before the other. But do you mean that they, I guess for lack of a better word, rock, paper, scissors each turn to decide which one would go ahead?
Yes.
Alright, so they decided each time that their singular turn came up, they decided which one of them would go first that time. Alright, that's interesting. How about you, Trevor? How would you deal with a tie?
I personally just like to have it re-rolled, and then after one time, you're done. You don't have to keep messing with it. So, like, they have a roll off with no bonus, and the winner goes first, and the other person goes right after them.
That's exactly how I deal with them. Alright. Now, base attack bonus. Base attack bonus is a very simple system. It is given to you by your class in a lot of different games. Some games don't have a base attack bonus because they have a different way of doing it. I might see if I can find one of those other sheets while I'm talking about this, but the basic idea is this, that your base attack bonus is given by your class, like I said, and it is the number that you get to use when you roll an attack. When you are trying to decide with your sword if you can hit that monster that's in front of you, you roll a base attack bonus. You roll a d20 plus that number, and that is how much you rolled to be able to hit them. And if that is higher than their AC, then congratulations, you have connected an attack and you deal damage.
Something important to bring up on that front is that a 20 is always an automatic hit or a natural 20. So if the die is a 20 and a 1 on the die is always an automatic failure, both
That
of which with their own unique circumstances.
that is correct. The way I always do it, especially, is that A 20 is a guaranteed hit, and a 20 is also a critical hit, which usually means you double the damage unless it says otherwise, which we'll get to in a minute with equipment. But the basic assumption is if you roll a natural 20, you've gotten a critical hit, and so you're going to do double damage, and you definitely hit them. And like you said, a natural 1 is always a failure, and it's very important to make sure that you guys out there watching understand when we say a natural 20, we mean, like he said, the dice comes up with a 20 on top. If you get what we call a modified 20, where let's say you have a base attack bonus of 5 and you rolled a 15, it adds up to 20, but because the dice itself did not stop with a 20 facing up as your roll, you did not get a critical hit. You got...
Even if the modified total exceeds 20.
Correct. You don't get to do double damage or triple or whatever. You don't get to do any kind of anything else tied to critical hits because it was not actually a critical. Now, it's also important to bring up a lot of base systems. I don't remember if 5e does this because I just decided to go ahead and do it the way I always do, but I know that Pathfinder uses a system of what it calls critical threats. When you roll a natural 20, it's called a critical threat. It is a guaranteed hit, but you have to roll another d20, and you have to roll another 20 on that d20 to get an actual critical hit, which I don't like because it takes something that's already very rare and makes it even more rare. It makes it a lot harder to get critical hits for the players, and I'm fine with doing it for monsters and for especially powerful enemies that the players had to fight against because they can sometimes be unfair, but making a person have to do something twice in a row like that is not very fun. Although I do also like, at least occasionally, to use what I call the critical degree system and the failure degree system, which is you roll a d20, you get a natural 1, you've already failed. It's a guarantee. But I have you roll another d20 to see how badly you fail. If you get another 1, then it's very, very bad. And if you rolled a natural 1 first and you roll a high number after that, all the way up to a natural 20, then you failed, but it's not all that bad. Same thing with a critical. If you rolled a critical hit, and you got a natural 1 on how amazing the critical was, then you still did double damage, but that's about it. Whereas if you get 2 20s in a row, then I guess somebody's head probably just... somebody's head exploded. Exactly. What about you guys, though? What do you guys like the idea of the critical threats versus just regular critical hits? How about you, Balasar?
Depends. Good bit of that could go towards something a lot more fun.
What do you mean by that?
Shenanigans and stuff.
No, I mean, you said a good bit of that could go towards something more fun. What do you mean, a good bit of that?
It depends on if you're DMing or not. If they roll a 1 and then they roll a 20, you could really mess with them or decide not to at all.
Alright. What about you, Trevor?
Okay, so I'm a fan of the degrees of failure because I always like when you fail critically that you could have anything happen from you accidentally kill yourself to maybe just missed a little bit and fucked up the environment. But degrees on criticals, I don't know about because you can make an encounter that otherwise would be a lot of fun for the whole party end instantly because you do something kind of ridiculous by sheer luck.
It's pretty much where I was going.
But at the same time, success can take what would be an otherwise
Are you there, Animus? Alright, I think we lost Animus. I think what he was trying to say, though, is that it can take what would otherwise be a... You know, I may be completely wrong, and I don't want to put words in his mouth. The thing I normally do with the degrees of critical success is, yes, the possibility of an instant kill, but I tried to make it more interesting than that. It could be that you did the critical hit, you got the double damage, and the reason why you got the double damage is because instead of just a normal attack, you ended up attacking the monster, and you also, with your sword, chopped into a piece of wood behind him that turned out to be a load-bearing beam in a house, and so you brought down part of the roof on top of him, which did extra damage to him or something. Or, for that matter, with magic, especially, I like the idea of magic being mysterious and strange. And so there's the possibility of, yes, you hit somebody with a magical spike that you just summoned out of the ground, and in addition to doing the double damage, it also gave you back 10 HP. It doesn't always have to be that it goes to an instant kill. It can, but it doesn't have to be that way, and it's like you said, if it is just a guaranteed that they're dead no matter what, then it's not going to make sense. And also, double damage is a lot. Some weapons have triple or more damage as well, but
It can get quite insane, especially with some classes like gunslingers who already have incredible damage without the crits.
well, the point that I'm making is that if you try to do always having it be an instant kill, then you could have the situation of, a barbarian with a great big axe in his hands. He attacks a dragon that has 1700 HP, and even though his axe does triple damage on a critical, his triple damage is only going to be, even with all of his stats, about, 50, 70 damage. And yet he rolled the 220s, and so it's somehow an instant kill? No, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, you could honestly argue if, like, he was on the thing's back and did a critical hit directly to its skull, that yes, he did a critical hit that was powerful enough and in the right spot to instant kill a 1700 HP monster without having done 1700 HP, but honestly, you're not going to be in that situation a lot, and the only people that really, really get heavy with the whole, well, I attacked them in the head, or I literally stabbed them in the eye, and so the creature should be dead, even though I haven't done a third of their HP yet in damage. The only people I've met that are really very strict about that have been very strict about everything else. They're generally not that much fun to play with, I find, and like I've said before, if you're not having fun, what the hell are you doing here?
Okay, I understand what you're coming at with then.
Yeah. Next is very important, weapons. Weapons, weapons, weapons. A weapon generally doesn't give you any bonus to your base attack, because your base attack isn't decided by the weapon that you're using, it's decided by, if you'll pardon the metaphor about metaphors here, your base attack is decided by your training. It would make no sense for it to be based only on the weapon, because that would mean that giving a knight a sword gives him the same ability to hit a monster as a peasant who's never even lifted a rock over his head, which wouldn't make any sense. However, there are weapons that give you a bonus to your attack. There are some weapons that are usually masterwork weapons. Sometimes it's enchanted weapons, though, which with enchanted weapons, it's explained away easily as just, well, it's magic, so there you go. Magic does what we need it to, whenever we need it to. That's how magic works, especially in literature. But with non-magical weapons that have an attack bonus, it's usually masterwork, and it's explained that it's so well made. It is a weapon that is so well balanced and so sharp that it's a little bit easier to hit with, which is why masterwork is usually a +1. And it's very rare for it to be anything higher than that. It also might give you a slightly more damage, which the way damage works with weapons depends entirely on the weapon, and it's always a certain number of dice. You will always have a weapon that is a longsword that does 1d6 or 1d8 or something like that.
And then, depending on what type of weapon it is, you'll add some kind of bonus from a stat. Like, if it's a finesse weapon, like a rapier, you'll add your dexterity to it, or your dexterity bonus to it. But if it's like a longsword, you would add
Strength
your
bonus.
strength bonus. Yeah.
Right. When you roll your attack with your given weapon, the kind of weapon it is defines what you add to it. You roll the d20, you add your base attack, and then, based on the kind of weapon it is, you add another stat that goes into it. With finesse weapons and with a lot of ranged weapons, especially in something like Pathfinder that's generally medieval, gunslingers notwithstanding, what you would roll is your dexterity with a bow and arrow or with a fencing saber or something like that. Whereas with a gigantic warhammer or a heavy battle axe or something, you would definitely roll your strength modifier. So you would roll base attack plus your strength modifier. That's how much you roll to hit the monster with that weapon. The thing that gets a little bit confusing and that I frequently can't keep track of because it changes so much between different systems is a lot of them want you to also add that stat modifier in to the damage. So let's say, once again, you have a longsword that does 1d6 of damage. Well, when you manage to do the hit with your base attack bonus, your strength bonus, and everything else, you've done the hit, so you roll 1d6 for your damage. You get 6 damage. You look at your character sheet, your strength modifier is a 3, and so instead of doing 6 damage, you did 9 damage. Again, it all depends on the weapon that you're using, and on the system that you're using. Some of them don't let you do that. And usually it's the ones that work, that deal with damage completely differently, which we're going to talk about in another episode because it's a lot to unpack.
To be fair, most Dungeons and Dragons systems do use the add your modifier to your damage as well.
Alright. As far as ammunition goes, ammunition depends usually on the group that you're with. For instance, me personally, when my players are using ranged attack weapons, it can be really difficult to actually keep track in the middle of combat of the amount of arrows that you've shot or crossbow bolts, or especially I found it difficult in Star Wars where you might have a blaster that has 7 clips in your inventory and each one has 50 shots to it, and you're trying to keep track of how much you've used and how much you've got left, and it's a lot to keep track of, which is why I tend to go for a more narrative system to make sure that people are enjoying themselves. And so generally I'm not worried about, well, I have a quiver with 10 arrows and I've shot 5, so I've only got 5 shots left. I mean, it can sound a little easy, and it honestly does sound a little easy to just give everybody infinite ammo, but at the same time, it can be really unfair to not let them still keep attacking.
Yeah, and my experience with ranged characters, because I tend to prefer either a ranged character or a caster, once you run out of your ammunition and or spell slots, you're practically useless to the engagements. You can just sit down and relax and
Right.
let everybody else handle it.
Right. The problem that people come into a lot with that is exactly like he says, you're basically useless if you're an archer and you've run out of arrows. And I'm sorry if it sounds like we're ignoring you, Balasar. We're not trying to, honestly. But if you run out of arrows and you're an archer, chances are you're wearing light armor, and chances are you might have a melee weapon, but your character is not going to be geared and not going to be set up to be doing a lot of melee weapon fighting. They're not built to be able to take damage. The same thing happens with rogues, although rogues are admittedly built for melee attacking, but rogues are also built for stealth, which is something we're going to have to talk about in another episode, which we're going to have to make sure that Animus has a stable connection for, because he knows a lot about that. He's played a lot of rogues in his day. Let's see what else is there. Skills. Skills in combat. Skills are not usually going to come up in combat except with magical characters. As you can see down here, it says that. Oh, I'm sorry. It says spellcraft right here in the skill list. Spellcraft is used for casting spells. It is definitely used a lot for different things. I believe in Pathfinder it's actually used as part of your turn, either as a concentration check or as the first strike for a spell. You know more about this than I do, though, Treva. Isn't that right? Am I
If
wrong?
I remember correctly, if the spell requires a concentration check, your spellcraft does go into that check.
All right, yeah. Fortitude, reflex, and will. This is where things get kind of complicated as far as combat, because it depends on the system that you're using. But fortitude, reflex, and will, systems tend to use them as only a reaction that is tied specifically to the kind of attack that's coming at you. Some attacks will let you either just take the damage straight up by your AC, and if the attack goes beyond your AC, then you take the hit and you take the damage. Others will say that if the attack is coming at you, you're allowed the chance to make a reflex roll to dodge it, or a fortitude check to take the damage but not be poisoned by it or something, or things of that nature. There's a lot of
Take
magic.
half damage, for instance, is very popular for magic things.
What was that, Trevor?
When it comes to a lot of spells, you have the opportunity to either normally reflex or fortitude for half damage a lot of the time.
That's true. That's true. And also, you can, specifically with mind affecting effects, which is more difficult to say than it is to read, but with mind affecting spells like fear spells, sleep spells, that kind of thing, it normally requires you to pass a will save to not be stunned or put to sleep or be caused to feel a bunch of fear and all of that, which another thing we should talk about is difficult terrain and debuffs given from combat. A lot of games like Pathfinder are designed with the idea of miniatures in mind and a map in mind so that you can easily see what's going on and where. And that's why when you look up here, it shows your base speed as being both feet and in squares. And it actually allows you to do an even more complicated system of the weight of your armor coming into play, giving you a different amount of speed with both feet and squares. And the same thing with flying, swimming, climbing, and burrowing. What difficult terrain means, though, is difficult terrain is perhaps a slippery patch of ice, maybe a hidden bit of quicksand, a bunch of thorns from some kind of bushes that are growing up on the ground underneath you. Anything that makes it difficult to pass quickly. It usually depends on what system as to how badly it affects your movement speed, but it will always affect it unless your character class says otherwise. And also unless your GM doesn't feel like using that particular system, yeah.
Rangers typically can get away without having to deal with difficult terrain, depending on the ranger, and some other classes can cast things, make it to where they're not affected by it. Like, for instance, a lot of caster classes can cast flight, which will allow you to just completely ignore it because you're flying.
Well, as I said before, magic kind of does whatever we need it to do at the time.
Yeah.
As far as rangers, I believe, at least in Pathfinder, rangers can ignore
their favorite terrain.
Right, they can ignore difficult terrain in their favorite terrain. Like a forest ranger can ignore difficult terrain as long as it is tied to a forest. If there's difficult brush and a bunch of roots and everywhere, he can still run at the same speed and not have a chance of falling down or hurting himself. He can still ride a horse without worrying about any kind of problems going on there. What was the other thing? Difficult terrain, definitely. Movement speed, the grid, the grid. There's range when you attack something is how far away an enemy can be when you attack them, which, using the grid example again, if you're in a square and you have a longsword, an enemy in any one of the really 6 squares next to you, you can attack them. If you have a spear, it normally allows you to go as far as 2 squares away from where you currently are. If you have a ranged weapon, it'll give you a certain number of squares or feet if you're not using a direct system of squares. Magic, on the other hand, tends to be more complicated in every way, always. It has a range. Depending on the individual spell, it may be a straight line.
A cone and or an area of effect.
Correct. It may be a cone, it may be an area of effect, or it may just be, like, for instance, a projectile, and so it works the same way as any kind of ranged character, where it's just, as long as it's within so many number of squares to you, you can hit it with this attack, assuming you've passed the attack roll naturally.
There are also touch-based magic attacks, and then the most incredible feat of gameplay ever, the ranged touch attack.
The magical range touch attack, yes. Magic is complicated, ladies and gentlemen. That's why there's going to be an entire episode on magic. There's someone, Micah, is going to come back for that episode, he said, because he knows a lot about doing magic in D&D. It's his favorite thing. Which you seem to enjoy as well, Trevor.
I like buffing people.
That's a good thing to move into next, is buffing characters, giving them advantages and disadvantages. It is useful, or at least it can be useful, to give the party advantages. It can also be useful to give the enemies that you're fighting a disadvantage of some variety. For instance, like the Pixie Bard we mentioned in the last episode, being able to put enemies to sleep. When you put an enemy to sleep, it essentially stops them from having a turn for at least one turn in a row, because their character was forced into an unconscious state. They cannot act. Usually, as soon as they take damage, they're going to be woken up by it. Also, it can be possible to blind a character, to cause fear or shock, something of that variety, to anything like that to make it more simple to hit them. About buffing characters, though, I'm honestly not that big an expert on it, so how about you take over for a second, Trevor?
Okay, so in buffing characters, there's normally only a few different ways to do this. It's not quite as varied as debuffing the enemy. You can normally give them a flat bonus on a skill check, which can be useful if you're trying to climb something and somebody's not very good at it. Just for instance, you can directly buff one of their stats. Like if you want to make someone do more damage in Pathfinder, you can buff whatever stat their weapon relies on. So say they're using a bow, you make their dexterity better and they do extra damage like that. You can also make people move faster or give them bonuses on trying to hit people, all of which can sway the events of a fight. And then there's of course healing, and then which is always a useful kind of thing, but I don't know if it's necessarily buffing.
What do you think, Balasar? Do you think healing counts as a buff? Alright. We may have lost Balasar as well.
Sorry,
Oh,
sorry.
Alright.
Well, it's usually I leave it up to the judgment of the DM, whether it's a buff or not.
Personally, I don't really consider it the same thing as a buff. I think of it as more... It's kind of its own thing. It's kind of its own category as far as buffing or debuffing. I mean, I know video games tend to put it in a similar category to buffing a character because you're taking something from where it is and you're making it be higher than normal. But it is honestly different because normally when you heal a character after the combat ends, the health stays where it is unless it is specifically labeled as temporary HP, which is a very
Which
important thing to remember in battle, in
that
any
is
kind of
another form
combat.
of buffing is giving temporary HP because some classes can give rather large buffers of temporary HP that you don't have to worry about.
Correct. The way temporary HP works, for those of you out there watching, is that you gain a separate pool of hit points to your normal one. Whenever damage comes in, as long as you have those temporary hit points, it has to come from that first. It's equivalent to if any of you watching have played Pokemon, I think it's called Substitute, right? Right, Belisar?
Yep.
Right. And the way Substitute works is your Pokemon basically puts a doll in front of themselves, and any attack the enemy does hits the doll first, so that way they don't have to take the damage themselves. The temporary HP takes the damage for you. If the battle ends, the temporary HP goes away, and you're left with however much HP you had before you did whatever it is that gave you the temporary. But it's very useful, especially when a character has less HP than everybody else. It's a good idea, if you can, give them some temporary HP to kind of throw it their way at the start of combat. The first Star Wars campaign that I was in, there was a player that was thankfully very gracious about using his temporary HP buff on me pretty much every combat because, well, I was very inexperienced and I had level 1 HP all the way up to being level 12. It was a difficult game doing it that way. As far as as far as party formation though in combat, I haven't really been a player in a party very often in a long time. So how about you start us off, Belisar? Do you generally try and get a feel for what the rest of the party is doing and then try to fill in the holes where they may be?
Yeah, I try to not to leave a big gap between whatever they're trying to do and eventually what I plan on doing.
All right. Let me ask you this though with it. I know that I've been with people that do this before. I don't really agree with doing it this way, but it again, like everything else, it comes down to the individual party you're in and how the people want to play. I was with a group for a while that two of the players in particular, every time their turn came up, they would always attack the enemy that either had not taken damage yet or still had the most HP at the time. Have you ever done that, Belisar? Do you like doing that kind of thing?
Depends on the situation. I'd rather go for the weak ones to get them out of the way.
What about you, Trevor?
Like you said, it really does depend on the situation because in some scenarios when there's a lot of enemies, if I'm like a high single target damage kind of character, like say a ranger or a gunslinger, I'll try to hit a bunch of people one at a time hard. So then someone else, like a wizard or something, can cast a fireball and do cleanup.
All right. Personally, I am also a fan of going after the weakest ones first because my particular philosophy on it is if we have 5 enemies coming at us, one is a boss and 4 are minions, the sooner we get the minions out of the way, the sooner we're only going to have to deal with the boss. But it does also, like I had mentioned in the last episode, it comes down to, and like I mentioned earlier, it comes down to what the party is doing. Which, if you're going by the sort of the MMO system of it, then you're gonna want somebody keeping the boss's attention, so that the people that can do a lot of damage really quickly can take care of everything else. Like if there's I'm going to go ahead and use an example from Chrono Trigger. There's a boss fight against this robot, this giant ass robot, and it has two little miniature robots with it. One of the miniature robots gives the boss a really powerful defensive field so that your attacks that normally do 200 plus damage are doing 5 and 10. The other one heals the boss every turn. And so you can theoretically go ahead and kill this boss without ever worrying about those other two until the boss is gone, but it's a lot more useful to go ahead and kill the one that's going to be healing the boss so that the boss doesn't get any health while you're trying to kill it. And then next focus on the one that gives it a very powerful defensive field before you focus on the boss itself, which in the situation of D&D would work out to where you have somebody trying to keep that boss monster's attention, somebody big and preferably in heavy armor like a paladin or something that can take a
Paladin,
bunch of
fighter,
hits.
barbarian, that kind of thing.
Right. Which fighters, especially in Pathfinder, fighters are my favorite class to use because they're so adaptable. For those of you that don't know, fighter is generally kind of an all-around fighter. Sometimes they're called warrior, sometimes they might be called something else. But the basic idea is that a fighter is exactly that. He's a fighter. He hits things really hard and they fall down. Barbarians are normally based around the berserk mode of just running in and attacking everything that isn't themselves until there's nothing left. But fighters, especially in Pathfinder, are about coming up with an idea, coming up with a way that you fight. You can have 3 different people all decide to be fighter and have those characters come out by level 5 looking nothing like one another. I've played a fighter that was in heavy armor, wielding a warhammer and a tower shield, and his whole thing was that he would get your attention because that's a lot of armor and that's a very heavy weapon, and most of the time he would just shield bash to keep your attention on him and to keep you from attacking other people. And one of the people in our group, Belisar and Treva, likes to do dual weapon fighting, so as a fighter he would go full into the dual weapon thing. He would make sure that he has a good strength bonus, but he also would make sure that his dexterity is good. He uses the fighter ability of getting feats every single level to make sure that he gets as little penalty as possible wielding 2 weapons, and that he gets to attack multiple times a turn, which can be a lot of fun and difficult. There's also fighters that are based around basically everything. It's kind of great. I like fighters a lot.
I'm not personally a big fan, but their adaptability is quite nice in combat because you can spec them out to be a ranged character, a melee character, somewhat of a mix if you really want to, because they have the ability to do so many different things.
Yes, that is very true. It is probably important enough that we should have mentioned it earlier, but it is possible to make an attack roll without a weapon. I do forget to mention these kind of things. Sometimes, unfortunately, we get kind of wrapped up in explaining systems and then things get forgotten, but you can absolutely make an attack without a weapon.
For example, there's a class that takes advantage of this to the fullest, which is the monk. It exemplifies the fact that pretty much every time you make a weapon attack, it'll allow you to take 1 or 2 additional attacks with an unarmed attack. So you're just punching shit after you hit it.
Now, normally, unarmed strikes, they work the same way as anything else. You use your base attack bonus and then your strength bonus, I believe, with unarmed. However, the damage dice is basically always going to be a d4. 1d4 each time that you hit, with the exception, admittedly, of the monk, because the monk is based around unarmed strikes, usually. Anyway.
Yeah, in the later game, as a monk, if you're a small creature, or a medium creature, I should say, by the end of the game, you're doing 2d4 per bait or per unarmed strike, and as a large creature by the end, you're doing 2d8. So it can actually be quite powerful.
Mm-hmm. There is a way of also upping the damage dice for that as well. Sometimes armor, specifically gauntlets, will give you an advantage to that. Speaking of advantage, in D&D 5th edition, which I don't really think I have a PDF of the character sheet to show you guys, but in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, they use a system that they call advantage, which is both inside of combat and outside of combat. And with advantage, if you're given advantage by something, then you roll the d20 to do whatever it is, then you roll the d20 again, and you take the better of the two numbers. If you get disadvantage from something, then you will roll a d20 to do the thing, then you will roll a d20 again and take the less high number of the two. And that is not the right sheet, I don't think. Yep, that's not the right sheet. This one is also not. Here's a good one though. It shows you have weapon attacks, it shows spell attacks and all of that, character name, alignment, everything else. The important thing though is advantage. It's an interesting system. It's useful for things. So, as far as being in combat, personally, I prefer not to go first. Because if I'm the one going first, then I'm the one trying to figure out who's where, what's going on, and what the enemies we're fighting are going to do. How about you, Belisar? Do you like to go first? Are you there, Belisar? Okay, well, how about you, Trevor? Do you like to go first?
It really does depend on the class that I'm playing at the time, because with some, like, especially when I'm a ranged character, I do like to go first, because I can do, like, a strong opening kind of move against whatever enemies, and then I'm probably not in danger of whatever their enemy is going to do.
Alright.
But if I'm like a support or if I'm like a caster, I like to go later in the turn so that way well, sometimes it depends because if I'm a caster, if I'm a buffing caster, I like to go first. So by the time that my allies are going around, they already have received whatever I'm trying to give them.
Right.
And then if I'm like a melee character, going first can be nice, but at the same time it's a little risky because if you run in and then whatever it is can just like destroy you, you're in a bad place.
So again, what about you, Belisar? Do you like to go first in combat, or do you usually prefer to wait?
It's like Travis said. It all depends. It depends on the class and how you want to how the situation goes. If you have a lot of like one or two buffers in the group, and at least two tanks and a ranged character, you definitely want at least one of the buffers buffing going first, then the melee, and then followed by the ranged attack.
Alright. I think there's a lot of good points there. You definitely want people that are going to be doing the buffing to go first before people start attacking. And it's useful to have whoever's playing the tank or otherwise whoever's going to be taking the attention of the boss or the big bad in the room. It's a good idea to have them go first as well, so that by the time the people that are somewhat more squishy get their turn to go, they don't have to worry about the boss coming directly after them as soon as the combat starts. It's a very good idea. And we are getting a little bit close to the time, so Once again, everybody, if you're still here, thank you for sticking around with us. I know it's a long journey to get through. Please stay tuned for next time. Please leave comments for us. What you like, what you don't like, experiences you've had in combat, whether or not you like the advantage system, the critical by degrees, or just a straight up critical. Personally, like I said, I'm not really a fan of the critical threat, but, have that in the comments if you guys like it or not. Also, once again, I have a Twitter for this show. I'm gonna be putting it in the comments section. I'm gonna be putting it in the description, a link to it. Feel free to comment there as well. Ask me any kind of questions. I am also always open for having other people join this show, especially people that are GMs, and especially people that are still new-ish to D&D. If you've only ever had one session, if you've only ever bought a pair of dice and you don't know what the hell we're talking about, please feel free to come on this show. I would love to have you on it, as this show is trying to help make joining D&D a little bit less scary and overwhelming. So, if you'd like to go ahead and say goodbye, Balasar.
Game some more and game later.
Would you like to say goodbye, Trevor? Alright, well.
And I didn't have to cook, but I'm on push to talk, so I forgot.
You might want to say goodbye one more time then, just in case.
Au revoir. Till next time.
Alright, and like I've started saying every time, the dice giveth and the dice taketh away.